The night began the way most nights did, without ceremony, without expectation, without the faintest hint that it would one day be remembered at all. The streets were quiet in the specific way only small towns ever manage. Not silent, but settled. The kind of quiet that carries familiarity instead of tension. Porch lights glowed like watchful eyes. A stray dog barked somewhere far off, then stopped. The air was cool enough to make breathing feel deliberate, grounding. It was the sort of night that lulled people into believing the world was stable, predictable, even kind. For the officer behind the wheel, this shift was supposed to be just another entry in a long string of identical nights. Same uniform, same routes, same radio chatter repeating the same codes that had long ago lost any emotional weight. Muscle memory guided the steering wheel as a patrol car rolled through neighborhoods that felt more like extensions of home than places of potential danger. Every stop sign was known. Every streetlight had its own rhythm, flickering or steady, dependable in its imperfections. There was comfort in that repetition. Comfort in knowing which houses always left their curtains open and which ones shut down by 9. Comfort in recognizing the one diner that never turned off its neon sign, even when it probably should have. Comfort in the idea that if something were wrong, it would announce itself loudly and clearly, sirens shouting urgency. Not this, not quiet. The radio crackled occasionally, not with alarms, but with mundane updates. A traffic stop that had already resolved itself. A locked storefront checked and cleared. Voices passed through the speaker without urgency, without fear. Just people doing their jobs, counting down the hours until sunrise made everything feel safe again. This was the danger of routine. Not that it bored you, but that it convinced you. It taught you that tonight would be like last night, and the night before that, and all the nights that came before. It whispered that patterns were promises. That experience could substitute for vigilance. That because nothing had happened yet, nothing ever would. The officer thought about ordinary things. A bill that needed paying. A weekend plan that might or might not happen. A cup of coffee waiting at the end of the shift. Thoughts floated easily, unguarded, because the night gave no reason to brace for impact. There was no sense of being watched. No prickle at the back of the neck. No instinctive tightening in the chest. Just roads. Just time passing. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded. Long, hollow, lonely. It echoed across the town, brushing against buildings that had stood for generations, absorbing secrets without ever revealing them. The sound faded, leaving behind the same quiet it had disturbed, as if nothing had changed at all. The patrol car slowed at an intersection. Tires whispered against the asphalt. The officer glanced around out of habit more than concern. Nothing moved. No shadows darted. No sudden motion demanded attention. The town fell asleep, and in that sleep, it felt harmless. It's easy in moments like these to forget how fragile normalcy really is, how thin the line can be between an uneventful night and a story that will be told in fragments decades later, how routine doesn't protect you. It only delays the moment you realize you were never protected at all. The officer checked the time. Still hours to go. Plenty of space for boredom to creep in. Plenty of space for nothing to happen. And nothing did. The car rolled on. Street after street passed without incident. Houses stood like quiet witnesses to lives unfolding behind closed doors. Arguments, laughter, dreams, disappointments, all hidden, all ongoing, all completely unrelated to what was about to occur. Or so it seemed. There was no sense of finality in the air. No cinematic warning. No gathering storm clouds. If someone had been watching from above, they would have seen only a single vehicle moving steadily through a grid of sleeping streets. A figure performing a duty, so routine it barely registered as a story at all. That's what makes nights like this so deceptive. They don't announce their significance. They don't slow down or sharpen your senses. They pass like any other, convincing everyone involved that tomorrow will come exactly as expected. The officer adjusted in the seat, reached for the radio, listened. Static breathed softly between transmissions. A familiar sound, a comforting one. Proof that the system was working, that everything was connected, accounted for. Somewhere deep beneath that sense of order, though, was a truth no one could feel yet. that systems only work until they don't. That connection is fragile. That silence, once it arrives, has a way of expanding. The patrol continued. The town slept. The night stretched forward, unbroken, unremarkable. And in that ordinariness, the story quietly positioned itself, waiting not for chaos, not for violence, but for a single moment when routine would crack just enough to let mystery slip through. When that moment came, it wouldn't arrive with noise or spectacle. It would arrive the way all devastating things do. Softly, unexpectedly, in the middle of a night that was never supposed to matter at all. The radio had always been a constant companion, a low, almost living presence humming between moments of thought. Its static filled the spaces that silence might otherwise claim, reminding the officer that even alone in the car, there was connection. Voices just a button press away, a network of listening ears stitched across the town. When the call came through, it didn't feel important at first. It slid into the night the same way all the others did, unannounced and unremarkable. A brief crackle, then a familiar voice identifying itself by habit more than necessity. Location given. Status shared. The kind of exchange repeated so many times it barely registered as speech anymore. It was muscle memory turned into sound. The officer responded automatically, eyes scanning the road ahead, hands steady on the wheel. The patrol car slowed slightly, not out of concern but reflex. This was the rhythm of the job. Listen, acknowledge, move on. Nothing in the tone suggested urgency. Nothing in the words hinted at danger. Then there was a pause. It was subtle, so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not listening closely. A fraction of a second longer than normal. Just enough to feel off. The officer began to speak again, voice coming to the radio comm, but no longer fluid. The sentence started the way it always did, but halfway through, something shifted. There was hesitation. Not fear exactly, at least not yet, but confusion, as if the officer was seeing something that didn't immediately make sense. The voice slowed, searching for the right words, the way someone does when they're trying to reconcile what they expect with what's actually in front of them. Dispatch waited. Other officers listened in, barely aware they were doing so. No one interrupted. No one rushed the moment along. There was no protocol for this kind of pause, because pauses usually meant nothing. The officer spoke again, quieter this time, less certain. A location was repeated, but it sounded different now, like a question rather than a statement. The radio picked up a faint sound in the background, movement, maybe, or fabric brushing against something hard. It was impossible to tell. And then, just as suddenly as the transmission had begun, it stopped. Not cleanly, not with a sign-off or a request for backup. The sentence simply ended. Cut short mid-thought, mid-breath. The radio clicked back into static, filling the space where a voice should have been. At first, no one panicked. Dispatch called the officer's name, expecting an immediate response. Sometimes radios glitched. Sometimes signals dropped for a second or two. It was inconvenient, not alarming. The dispatcher's tone remained neutral, professional, practiced. No answer came back. Another attempt. Then another. Each one slightly sharper than the last. Static answered every time, indifferent and unhelpful. The background hum of the system suddenly felt louder, more intrusive, as if it were trying to drown out the absence it was now responsible for. Other officers shifted in their seats, glancing at their own radios. A few exchanged looks they didn't yet understand the meaning of. Someone joked weakly about dead zones, about technology failing at the worst times. The laughter didn't last, because silence has a way of changing shape when it lingers too long. Minutes passed, and the absence began to feel heavy. The officer's patrol car was still transmitting its location. The system showed movement had slowed, then stopped altogether. That detail, more than the silence itself, sent a quiet ripple of unease through the room. Dispatch tried again, this time asking for a status check. The words hung in the air, unanswered. The radio offered only static in return. No distortion, no muffled reply, just emptiness dressed up as noise. It was in that moment that the tone changed. Professional calm gave way to something tighter, more alert. Backup units were requested, their voices suddenly sharp, clipped, focused. The routine cadence of the night fractured, replaced by urgency that hadn't existed just moments before. What troubled them most wasn't what they had heard. It was what they hadn't. There was no shout, no sound of a struggle, no clear indication of danger. Just a voice that had been there, and then wasn't. A sentence that had begun confidently and ended nowhere. An interruption without explanation. As officers headed toward the last known location, radios buzzed with overlapping chatter. Questions were asked that no one could answer yet. Was the officer out of the vehicle? Had there been a traffic stop? Was there an equipment failure? Each theory felt flimsy, insufficient, because none of them explained the hesitation in the voice. That pause replayed itself in the minds of those who had heard it. The way the officer had slowed down, as if trying to process something unexpected. The way the tone had shifted, not panicked, not alarmed, but uncertain, as though reality itself had momentarily misaligned. The patrol car sat where the signal said it should be. Engine off, lights dark, no response to radio or siren. Officers arrived with caution they hadn't felt necessary at the start of the night. Flashlights cut through the darkness, beams steady, but hands not quite as sure as they'd been earlier. They called out the officer's name into the night. Once, twice. The sound carried, then dissolved into the same quiet that had fooled everyone before. No answer came back. Not from the radio. Not from the shadows. Not from anywhere at all. Inside the car, everything was exactly where it should have been. Keys accounted for. Equipment untouched. The door closed, not slammed, not left ajar. It was as if the officer had simply stepped out of the narrative. Back at dispatch, the recording of the radio transmission was replayed again and again. Each time, listeners leaned in a little closer, hoping to hear something new, a hidden sound, a clue buried in the static. But the tape offered nothing more than it had the first time, just a voice, a pause, and silence. That unfinished sentence became the center of everything that followed. It was dissected, analyzed, speculated over for years. People would argue about its meaning, about whether the officer had seen someone or something, about whether the moment could have been prevented if someone had reacted faster. But in that first hour, all anyone felt was the weight of interruption, because stories aren't supposed to stop like that. Nights aren't supposed to break in the middle of a thought. Voices don't just vanish without leaving something behind. And yet, that's exactly what happened. A routine call turned into an open question. A familiar voice became an echo, and a system designed to connect people instead delivered the most unsettling message of all: nothing. The radio had always been a constant companion, a low, almost living presence humming between moments of thought. Its static filled the spaces that silence might otherwise claim, reminding the officer that even alone in the car, there was connection. Voice is just a button press away, a network of listening ears stitched across the town. When the call came through, it didn't feel important at first. It slid into the night the same way all the others did, unannounced and unremarkable. A brief crackle, then a familiar voice identifying itself by habit more than necessity. Location given. Status shared. The kind of exchange repeated so many times it barely registered as speech anymore. It was muscle memory turned into sound. The officer responded automatically, eyes scanning the road ahead, hands steady on the wheel. The patrol car slowed slightly, not out of concern, but reflex. This was the rhythm of the job. Listen, acknowledge, move on. Nothing in the tone suggested urgency. Nothing in the words hinted at danger. Then there was a pause. It was subtle, so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not listening closely. A fraction of a second longer than normal. Just enough to feel off. The officer began to speak again, voice coming through the radio comm, but no longer fluid. The sentence started the way it always did, but halfway through, something shifted. There was hesitation. Not fear exactly. At least not yet, but confusion. As if the officer was seeing something that didn't immediately make sense. The voice slowed, searching for the right words, the way someone does when they're trying to reconcile what they expect with what's actually in front of them. Dispatch waited. Other officers listened in, barely aware they were doing so. No one interrupted. No one rushed the moment along. There was no protocol for this kind of pause, because pauses usually meant nothing. The officer spoke again, quieter this time, less certain. A location was repeated, but it sounded different now, like a question rather than a statement. The radio picked up a faint sound in the background, movement, maybe, or a fabric brushing against something hard. It was impossible to tell. And then, just as suddenly as the transmission had begun, it stopped. Not cleanly, not with a sign-off or request for backup. The sentence simply ended. Cut short mid-thought, mid-breath. The radio clicked back into static, filling the space where a voice should have been. At first, no one panicked. Dispatch called the officer's name, expecting an immediate response. Sometimes radios glitched. Sometimes signals dropped for a second or two. It was inconvenient, not alarming. The dispatcher's tone remained neutral, professional, practiced. No answer came back. Another attempt. Then another, each one slightly sharper than the last. Static answered every time, indifferent and unhelpful. The background hum of the system suddenly felt louder, more intrusive, as if it were trying to drown out the absence it was now responsible for. Other officers shifted in their seats, glancing at their own radios. A few exchanged looks they didn't yet understand the meaning of. Someone joked weakly about dead zones, about technology failing at the worst times. The laughter didn't last, because silence has a way of changing shape when it lingers too long. Minutes passed, and the absence began to feel heavy. The officer's patrol car was still transmitting its location. The system showed movement had slowed, then stopped altogether. That detail, more than the silence itself, sent a quiet ripple of unease through the room. Dispatch tried again, this time asking for a status check. The words hung in the air, unanswered. The radio offered only static in return. No distortion, no muffled reply, just emptiness dressed up as noise. It was in that moment that the tone changed. Professional calm gave way to something tighter, more alert. Backup units were requested, their voices suddenly sharp, clipped, focused. The routine cadence of the night fractured, replaced by urgency that hadn't existed just moments before. What troubled them most wasn't what they had heard. It was what they hadn't. There was no shout, no sound of a struggle, no clear indication of danger. Just a voice that had been there, and then wasn't. A sentence that had begun confidently and ended nowhere. An interruption without explanation. As officers headed toward the last known location, radios buzzed with overlapping chatter. Questions were asked that no one could answer yet. Was the officer out of the vehicle? Had there been a traffic stop? Was there an equipment failure? Each theory felt flimsy, insufficient, because none of them explained the hesitation in the voice. That pause replayed itself in the minds of those who had heard it. The way the officer had slowed down, as if trying to process something unexpected. The way the tone had shifted. Not panicked, not alarmed, but uncertain, as though reality itself had momentarily misaligned. The patrol car sat where the signal said it should be. Engine off, lights dark, no response to radio or siren. Officers arrived with caution. They hadn't felt necessary at the start of the night. Flashlights cut through the darkness, beams steady but hands not quite as sure as they had been earlier. They called out the officer's name into the night. Once, twice. The sound carried, then dissolved into the same quiet that had fooled everyone before. No answer came back. Not from the radio. Not from the shadows. Not from anywhere at all. Inside the car, everything was exactly where it should have been. Keys accounted for. Equipment untouched. The door closed, not slammed, not left ajar. It was as if the officer had simply stepped out of the narrative. Back at dispatch, the recording of the radio transmission was replayed again and again. Each time, listeners leaned in a little closer, hoping to hear something new, a hidden sound, a clue buried in the static. But the tape offered nothing more than it had the first time. Just a voice, a pause, and silence. That unfinished sentence became the center of everything that followed. It was dissected, analyzed, speculated over for years. People would argue about its meaning, about whether the officer had seen someone or something, about whether the moment could have been prevented if someone had reacted faster. But in that first hour, all anyone felt was the weight of interruption, because stories aren't supposed to stop like that. Nights aren't supposed to break in the middle of a thought. Voices don't just vanish without leaving something behind. And yet, that's exactly what happened. A routine call turned into an open question. A familiar voice became an echo, and a system designed to connect people instead delivered the most unsettling message of all: nothing. The search began with momentum, the kind fueled by adrenaline and certainty. Lights cut through the darkness as patrol cars arrived one after another, engines humming, doors opening and closing with purpose. Flashlights snapped on. Voices called out. There was an unspoken belief shared among them all that whatever had happened could still be fixed, that this was misunderstanding, a delay, a momentary breakdown in communication that would resolve itself if they moved quickly enough. They spread out methodically, boots scuffing against asphalt, beams of light sweeping across curbs, yards, and alleyways. The area was familiar to all of them. They knew which fences were loose, which houses had dogs, which corners collected trash when the wind shifted. Familiarity was supposed to help. It was supposed to make the search easier. Instead, it made the emptiness more unsettling. The patrol car sat where the signal had said it would be, parked neatly, not crooked or rushed. No flashing lights. No open doors. It looked like it was waiting for someone to come back. The engine was cold when someone placed a hand near the hood, a quiet confirmation that time had already slipped further than anyone wanted to admit. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed. The radio was in its cradle, the seat adjusted to a comfortable position, not pushed back abruptly or shifted in haste. Personal items were exactly where they should have been, arranged with the unconscious order that comes from habit. It did look like a scene that needed explaining, and that somehow made it worse. They searched the immediate area first, widening the circle with each pass. Grass was checked for impressions. Dirt along the roadside was scanned for marks that didn't belong. Nearby trees were illuminated, their branches casting long, distorted shadows that moved when flashlights did. The night air felt thicker now, heavier, as if it were holding its breath along with them. No footprints led away from the car. No signs of a struggle marked the ground. No dropped equipment. No torn fabric. No indication that another person had been there at all. The absence was complete, almost deliberate in its thoroughness. Someone suggested checking nearby buildings. Doors were knocked on. Porch lights flicked on in confusion as residents were pulled from sleep, blinking against the sudden intrusion. Questions were asked gently at first, then more directly. Had anyone seen or heard anything unusual? A shout? A vehicle? Anything out of place? The answers were always the same. No, nothing. Just another quiet night. As the hours stretched on, the search grew larger and more complicated. Additional units were called in. Areas that had seemed irrelevant at first were now treated as potential pieces of a puzzle no one understood. Fields were walked in slow, careful lines. Ditches were inspected. Every place where a person could reasonably go was checked, then checked again. Still nothing. The lack of evidence began to change the tone of the operation. At first, there had been urgency, voices sharp, movements quick. Now there was something else layered on top of it. Confusion. Disbelief. A creeping frustration that had nowhere to land. Because searches are built around clues. Even bad clues give direction. They suggest a story, however fragmented. But here, there was no story at all. Just a blank space where a person should have been. Investigators returned the patrol car again and again, as if it might offer something new if they looked at it from the right angle. They examined it inch by inch. The exterior showed no damage. The tires were clean. The trunk held exactly what it was supposed to hold. Inside, the smell of the officer's cologne lingered faintly, an intimate reminder that this had been occupied moments or hours before. That smell stayed with them. It was discussed later, in quiet conversations and official reports, how unsettling it felt to stand there, surrounded by proof of presence and yet faced with total absence. The car didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, like someone had stepped away with every intention of returning. As dawn approached, fatigue began to blur the edges of focus. Flashlight batteries dimmed. Coffee cups accumulated. The search continued, but the initial confidence had drained away, replaced by something more fragile. Hope still existed, but it no longer felt solid. Questions multiplied. If the officer had left the vehicle willingly, where had they gone? Why hadn't they radioed in? Why take nothing? If someone else had been involved, how had they managed to leave no trace? No sound, no sign. It didn't fit any pattern the investigators recognized. And that was a problem. Cases are built on patterns. Training prepares you for scenarios, for probabilities. But this situation refused to align with anything familiar. It sat outside expectation, resisting categorization. By mid-morning, the search shifted again. Procedures expanded. Reports were filed. Outside agencies were notified. The disappearance was no longer a possibility. It was official. The word itself felt heavy, difficult to say out loud. Disappearance. It implied time passing without resolution. It implied waiting. It implied the possibility that answers might never come. The town began to wake up, unaware at first of what had unfolded while it slept. News traveled quickly, carried by phone calls and quiet conversations. People drove past the search area, slowing down instinctively, sensing that something was wrong even if they didn't yet know what. Those involved in the search felt the weight of scrutiny settle onto their shoulders. Every decision made in those first hours would be examined later, replayed, questioned. Did they search the right places first? Did they miss something small but crucial? The absence offered no reassurance either way. As the day wore on, the realization set in with growing clarity. They weren't looking for evidence anymore. They were looking for a narrative. Something, anything, that could explain how a person could vanish from a locked-in routine, from a car full of their belongings, from a night that had offered no warning. But the ground remained silent. The buildings offered nothing. The air itself seemed to conspire in withholding answers. The search eventually slowed, not because hope had died, but because there was nowhere left to look that made sense. The area had been covered, the obvious possibilities exhausted. What remained were questions that felt less like investigative challenges and more like philosophical ones. How does someone disappear without a trace? How does nothing happen so completely that it becomes the most important detail of all? As the sun climbed higher, casting ordinary light over an extraordinary absence, one truth became impossible to ignore. The search hadn't failed because they didn't try hard enough. It had failed because there was nothing to find. And in that realization, the case took on a new, deeply unsettling identity, not as a crime with evidence waiting to be uncovered, but as a mystery defined entirely by what wasn't there. At first, the town responded the way communities always do when something unthinkable brushes too close. With unity, with hope, with a shared refusal to accept a version of reality that suggested one of their own could simply vanish. Word spread quickly, reshaped with each retelling. By the second day, nearly everyone knew the officer's name, knew where the patrol car had been found, knew just enough to feel personally unsettled. Storefront windows displayed handwritten signs offering prayers and support. People who had never spoken more than a polite greeting now stood together in small clusters, trading fragments of information and speculation in hushed voices. There was comfort in being together, comfort in believing that if enough people cared, if enough eyes were watching, the story would resolve itself. That the officer would be found, confused, maybe hurt, but alive. The alternative was too heavy to consider. Candlelight vigils were organized in the town square. Flames flickered against the dark, reflected in faces drawn tight with worry. Speakers stepped forward to talk about dedication, about service, about how some people are simply too steady, too rooted, to ever disappear willingly. The officer was described in reassuring terms, reliable, familiar, part of the fabric of the town itself. That language mattered. By framing the officer as a symbol rather than a person, the town protected itself. Symbols don't vanish forever. They come back. They're found. They're restored to their rightful place. People, on the other hand, can be lost in ways that defy reason. Flyers appeared on telephone poles and bulletin boards. The same photograph stared back from every corner, smiling, composed, taken on a day when the future felt guaranteed. People lingered in front of those images longer than necessary, as if proximity alone might bridge the gap between what was and what now wasn't. Rumors began almost immediately. Some were gentle, even hopeful. Maybe the officer had followed a lead off the books. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding, a missed call, a delay in communication. Maybe the truth was simpler than it seemed, and everyone was just overreacting. Others were less kind. Whispers circulated about burnout, about secrets, about lives that looked stable from the outside, but quietly unravel behind closed doors. Someone remembered a conversation from months ago and replayed it with new suspicion. Someone else pointed out a detail that had never seemed important before, but now felt loaded with meaning. These stories spread not because people wanted to be cruel, but because uncertainty demands explanation. When facts are scarce, imagination fills the gaps. And imagination, left unchecked, can be merciless. The officer's family lived inside that noise. Every knock on the door made their hearts jump. Every phone call carried the possibility of answers. They learned quickly how hope and dread could coexist, how relief could collapse into despair in the span of a single breath. They were asked the same questions repeatedly. Did the officer seem stressed? Were there problems at work? At home? Each question felt like a test they were failing, as if not knowing something meant they had missed a warning sign they were supposed to catch. In public, the town spoke with confidence. In private, doubt crept in. As days turned into weeks, the initial urgency softened into something more diffuse. Search efforts continued, but the crowds grew smaller. News coverage shifted focus. News stories pushed this one lower on the list, mentioned briefly, then not at all. Still, the town resisted finality. People continued to speak about the officer in the present tense. When they come back, once this is sorted out, language became a shield against the possibility that there might not be an ending anyone wanted to face. There was a strange balance to maintain. On one hand, people wanted to believe the officer was alive, somewhere waiting to be found. On the other, they needed an explanation that allowed them to sleep at night. Those needs didn't always align. Some found comfort in believing the disappearance was a choice, that the officer had walked away, intentionally or not, from a life that had grown too heavy. It was a painful thought, but it was also contained. It suggested control, agency, a reason. Others clung to the idea of an accident, an injury, a disorientation, a moment of bad luck. That version preserved the officer's character while still allowing for tragedy. It was easier to accept than randomness. What almost no one wanted to consider was the idea that the disappearance was something stranger, something that didn't fit neatly into personal failure or misfortune, because that idea implied vulnerability. It suggested that safety was an illusion, that the structures meant to protect them could simply fail. The town began to change in subtle ways. Doors were locked earlier. Porch lights stayed on longer. People glanced twice at unfamiliar cars. Parents asked their children to check in more often. None of these changes were dramatic enough to draw comment, but together they formed a quiet shift in how people related to their surroundings. The officer's absence became a kind of background presence, not always discussed, but never entirely forgotten. It surfaced in conversations unexpectedly, triggered by a siren in the distance or a patrol car passing by. Each reminder carried a small jolt of unease. Official statements emphasized patience. Investigations take time. Leads were being followed. Nothing was being ruled out. The words were carefully chosen, designed to reassure without promising too much. But patience is easier to preach than to practice. As months passed, the town's relationship with the mystery grew complicated. Hope became something people rationed, bringing it out on anniversaries or during organized events, then tucking it away again to avoid constant disappointment. Grief lingered without a clear outlet, suspended in uncertainty. Some people moved on more quickly than others. Life demanded it. Jobs, families, routines all required attention. But even those who stopped actively thinking about the case carried it with them in quieter ways. A story told once too often. A pause in conversation when the officer's name came up. The town never fully accepted the disappearance, but learned how to live around it. And in that refusal to believe, in that collective reshaping of the narrative to make it bearable, something important happened. The truth, whatever it was, began to blur. Not because anyone intended to obscure it, but because certainty had become too painful to pursue directly. The officer was still missing. The answers were still absent. But the town had found a way to soften the edges of that reality, wrapping it in ritual and rumor and hope. It was a fragile arrangement, one that would hold. Just barely, until time, and something buried beneath it, decided to break the silence again. Time did what it always does to unanswered questions. It didn't resolve them. It dulled them. The case didn't close in any dramatic way. There was no final meeting where someone declared the search over. No moment where hope officially ended. Instead, the investigation slowed in increments so small they were almost invisible. A lead that went nowhere. A call that turned out to be nothing. A promise to follow up that quietly expired. The file grew thicker even as progress thinned. Reports were added. Tips were logged. Each page carried the weight of effort, of hours spent trying to impose order on something that refused to be organized. And then, gradually, the addition stopped. Detectives rotated off the case. Some were reassigned. Some retired. Others moved to different departments, taking their familiarity with the details with them. Each transition left a small gap in understanding, a piece of context that didn't quite make it into the notes. The officer's disappearance became something people referred to in past tense, even though it had never been resolved. Back when that happened, when the officer went missing, language shifted subtly, signaling a quiet acceptance that whatever answers existed were not coming soon. The physical evidence, or lack of it, was preserved as carefully as possible. The patrol car was processed, reprocessed, then stored. Items were cataloged and sealed. Everything was done by the book. But procedure has limits. It can only preserve what exists. It can't create meaning where there is none. Occasionally, a new idea would surface. Someone would re-examine the radio logs. Someone else would revisit the timeline, hoping to spot an inconsistency that had been overlooked. These efforts were sincere, but they were also constrained by the same immovable reality. Nothing new had emerged. The case file became a kind of artifact. It sat on shelves, labeled, referenced, sometimes pulled down when a similar disappearance made someone wonder if there might be a connection. Each time, it offered the same answers it always had. None. Years passed. The town changed. Businesses closed and reopened under new names. Streets were repaved. New houses appeared where empty lots once sat. Children who had attended the early vigils grew up, left, or started families of their own. For them, the disappearance was a story they had inherited, not an event they remembered. For those who had lived through it, the memory settled into a quieter place. It surfaced on anniversaries, during conversations about the past, or when someone new asked why a particular stretch of road still carried a strange reputation. But it no longer dominated daily life. That, in itself, carried a kind of guilt. People wonder if forgetting, even partially, was a betrayal, if moving forward meant abandoning the person who had been left behind by circumstance. But life has a way of insisting on continuity, regardless of unresolved grief. Inside the department, the case took on a different character. It was no longer an active investigation, but wasn't officially cold either. It existed in a gray space, open in theory, dormant in practice, a file that waited patiently for something to disturb its sleep. When new officers were trained, the disappearance was sometimes mentioned, not as a warning exactly, but as a reminder, a story shared in low voices, stripped of speculation and reduced to facts, an example of how unpredictability could intrude even on the most routine assignments. Those conversations rarely lasted long. There was an unspoken understanding that dwelling too deeply on the case made people uncomfortable. It challenged assumptions about safety and control that were necessary to do the job. The officer's family continued to exist alongside the investigation's slow fade. They learned how to live with uncertainty as a constant companion. Every year that passed without answers was another year suspended between hope and resignation. They marked time differently. Anniversaries of the disappearance became moments of reflection rather than expectation. Birthdays were acknowledged with quiet rituals, small gestures that kept the officer present in absence. Photographs were displayed, then moved, then displayed again, their meaning shifting as memories aged. Occasionally, a tip would arrive that reignited attention, a supposed sighting in another state, a name mentioned in passing. Each one brought a brief resurgence of energy, a flurry of calls and paperwork, and then, inevitably, disappointment. These cycles took a toll. Over time, hope learned to protect itself by lowering its voice. The investigation's slow erosion wasn't the result of apathy. It was a consequence of limits, of finite resources, of competing priorities, of the simple fact that some mysteries do not offer themselves easily, but intention mattered less than impact. As the years accumulated, the disappearance became part of institutional memory rather than active concern. It was remembered but not pursued, known but not understood. The file was moved more than once. Offices were reorganized, storage systems updated. Each relocation carried the risk of something being misplaced, overlooked, or misinterpreted by someone unfamiliar with the original context. The case survived these transitions, but it emerged thinner in ways that didn't show on paper. What remained constant was the absence. No body, no explanation, no definitive narrative to anchor the facts. The disappearance resisted closure not through complexity, but through simplicity. There was too little, not too much. That kind of mystery is particularly corrosive. It doesn't challenge you with puzzles. It exhausts you with emptiness. It invites speculation but punishes certainty. By the time decades had passed, the officer's name was known mostly to those who sought it out deliberately. True crime enthusiasts, new detectives with a taste for old cases, journalists looking for stories that never quite resolved. To everyone else, it was a shadow on the town's history, something acknowledged, then set aside. The case file rested quietly, its pages yellowing, its edges worn. It waited not because anyone expected a breakthrough, but because letting go completely felt wrong. As long as the file existed, so did the possibility, however faint, that the story wasn't finished. What no one knew then was that time, which had dulled so much, had also preserved something else, something hidden, something patient. And when it finally emerged, it wouldn't do so gently. The return of the story did not come with an announcement. It didn't arrive wrapped in ceremony or intention. It surfaced the way buried things often do, by accident, disturbed by people who had no idea what they were about to uncover. Plans had been approved months earlier. Expansion, development, another sign that time had moved forward, without waiting for the past to catch up. Crews arrived with maps and measurements, confident in their understanding of what lay beneath the ground. Soil reports were routine. Surveys were clean. There was nothing on record to suggest anything unusual. At first, it was just an inconsistency, a reading that didn't quite align with expectations. Equipment registering density where there shouldn't have been any, the kind of thing that usually resolves itself with recalibration or a second pass. But it didn't. The anomaly stayed put, stubborn and exact, a shape beneath the earth that resisted easy explanation, not natural, not accidental, something structured, deliberate, something that had been placed there. Work paused, questions were asked, older records were pulled, then older ones still. No permits matched what the instruments were showing. No mention of underground construction appeared in municipal archives. It was as if the ground itself had learned how to lie. When excavation finally began, it was done cautiously. Layers of soil peeled back slowly, revealing materials that didn't belong to the landscape. Reinforced concrete, metal edges worn smooth by time but unmistakably engineered. This wasn't debris. This wasn't a foundation. It was a door. The moment word began to spread, the past stirred. Names that hadn't been spoken aloud in years found their way back into conversation. The officer's disappearance resurfaced not as a memory, but as a question that suddenly felt urgent again. Because this wasn't just something old. It was something hidden. Authorities were notified. Access was restricted. Curiosity collided with unease as specialists arrived. their faces serious in a way that suggested this was no longer a simple construction issue. The structure was assessed, documented, approached with a care that hinted at what it might contain. When the entrance was finally opened, air escaped that had not circulated in decades. It carried the unmistakable smell of stagnation. Not rot, not decay, but time itself, sealed and undisturbed. The bunker descended into the earth, its interior swallowed by darkness that flashlights struggled to fully penetrate. What struck people first was how intact it was. Walls uncracked, systems long dormant but still recognizable. This place had not been forgotten by accident. It had been built to endure, to remain hidden, to outlast curiosity. Whoever designed it had assumed patience would be enough. As investigators moved through the space, the silence felt heavier than it should have. Sound behaved differently underground, swallowed quickly, refusing to echo. Every footstep felt intrusive, like an interruption rather than an exploration. The bunker wasn't chaotic. It wasn't abandoned in haste. It was orderly, purposeful, and that order suggested planning. Someone had anticipated the future well enough to prepare for it. Rooms branched off from a central corridor. Equipment sat where it had last been used. Not destroyed, not dismantled, simply left. Time had settled over everything evenly, like dust over furniture in a house no one expected to return to. As word of the discovery reached the public, a familiar tension returned to town. Not hope exactly, but attention. People who had learned to live around the mystery felt it pressed back into their lives. Conversations shifted. Old questions were asked again, this time with sharper edges. Could this be connected? The question hovered everywhere. Officials were careful with their language. Too careful, some thought. Statements emphasized ongoing investigation, historical context, the need for thorough review. They did not deny a connection. They also did not confirm one. But silence has its own implications. Those who had worked the original case felt something close to disbelief. The idea that something so substantial could have existed unnoticed for decades felt like an indictment, not just of the investigation, but of reality itself. How many times had people stood above this place, unaware of what lay beneath their feet? The bunker reframed everything. The disappearance no longer felt like a moment lost to chance or confusion. It began to look like a point of intersection, between routine and secrecy, between an ordinary night and something deliberately concealed. Records were re-examined with fresh eyes. Old timelines were overlaid with maps of underground infrastructure. Questions once dismissed as unanswerable were asked again, now armed with a physical anchor. Why here? Why this location? Why now? The deeper investigators went, the more the story resisted simplicity. The bunker did not scream conspiracy in the cinematic sense. There were no obvious symbols, no dramatic declarations carved into walls. Instead, there was a quieter, more unsettling implication that this place had existed within systems people trusted, without ever being acknowledged by them. It suggested omission rather than spectacle. And omission is harder to confront. For the officer's family, the news arrived like a delayed shockwave. Something that had been buried, emotionally and literally, was suddenly exposed. Hope returned, but it was cautious, restrained by decades of disappointment. Answers, if they came, would arrive late, possibly too late. Still, the possibility changed everything. The disappearance was no longer abstract. It was tied to a location, a structure, a tangible reality. The question was no longer whether something had happened, but what and why it had been hidden so effectively. As investigators sealed off the site for further analysis, the town found itself standing at the edge of something it had spent years trying not to look at directly. The past was no longer content to remain quiet. It had surfaced, heavy and intact, demanding to be acknowledged. The ground had kept it secret for 37 years. Now that it had given it up, there was no putting it back. And whatever answers waited below, they were not going to restore the comfort of not knowing. Understanding the bunker meant peeling away layers that had nothing to do with concrete or steel and everything to do with intent. It wasn't enough to know that it existed. The harder question was why it had never appeared anywhere it should have. No blueprints, no permits, no whisper acknowledgement buried in footnotes or forgotten ledgers. For something so solid, so deliberately constructed, it had left an impossible absence in the official record. Investigators began where logic suggested they should. Archives. Old municipal documents were revisited, some so brittle they had to be handled with gloves. Zoning records. Emergency planning files. Infrastructure maps that charted water lines, electrical conduits, and storm drains in meticulous detail. The bunker appeared in none of them. It was as if it had been built in a blind spot, one not of geography, but of authority. That absence told its own story. Because things don't simply vanish from paperwork by accident. Not consistently. Not across decades and multiple systems. Omission at that scale required either extraordinary negligence or intentional silence. And as the scope of the search widened, it became increasingly clear that this was not negligence. The materials used in the bunker suggested resources. Reinforced concrete of a quality not typical for civilian project of the era. Ventilation systems designed to function without drawing attention. Power connections that hinted at redundancy, at foresight. This was not a makeshift structure. It was engineered. And engineering requires approval, unless approval is granted somewhere else entirely. Attention turned to federal and state records, Cold War-era projects, civil defense initiatives, programs that had once operated under the assumption that secrecy was synonymous with safety. In those decades, things had been built quickly, quietly, and often with minimal public disclosure. Fear had a way of justifying erasure. But even there, the bunker refused to introduce itself. No matching descriptions, no coordinates, no declassified references that aligned cleanly with what had been found. The more it was searched for, the more it seemed to retreat into a category of its own, unofficial, unacknowledged, unaccountable. That realization shifted the tone of the investigation. This was no longer just about uncovering a forgotten structure. It was about confronting the possibility that something had been intentionally excluded from collective memory, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded at staying hidden. The bunker's layout added to the unease. It wasn't sprawling, but it wasn't minimal either. Every space felt calculated, balanced between functionality and discretion. No signage, no markings to indicate ownership or purpose. Just rooms designed to be used, then left behind without explanation. It was secrecy made physical. As experts studied the construction, they noted how effectively it blended into its surroundings. The entrance had been masked beneath layers of earth and vegetation that matured naturally over time. From above, there was nothing to see. No unnatural contours. No reason to suspect anything beneath the surface. That kind of concealment suggested long-term thinking. Whoever built it had assumed decades would pass. That people would forget. That curiosity would dull. And they had been right. The question of who authorized the bunker led into uncomfortable territory. Because if no record existed, then accountability dissolved. There was no single agency to interrogate. No straightforward chain of command to trace. Responsibility diffused into abstraction. People in positions of authority were careful with their responses. Some genuinely knew nothing. Others spoke in qualified language, acknowledging possibilities without confirming specifics. A few declined to comment altogether, citing matters of national security. Even now, even after all this time, that phrase hung heavily in the air. National security. It had been used before to justify silence, to explain why some truths were deemed too dangerous for public understanding. And once invoked, it tended to shut doors rather than open them. For those revisiting the officer's disappearance, this context was deeply unsettling. It reframed the mystery not as a failure to find answers, but as a success in preventing them from being seen. The idea that a routine night patrol could intersect with something so thoroughly hidden forced a reevaluation of assumptions that had once felt solid. The officer hadn't disappeared into chaos. They had disappeared into structure. That distinction mattered, because chaos is unpredictable. Structure is designed. The bunker suggested that systems had been in place. Systems that operated parallel to everyday life, invisible to those not meant to see them. It implied that the officer, through chance or duty, had crossed a boundary they were never supposed to encounter. That possibility raised another, quieter fear, that others might have crossed similar boundaries without realizing it, that the bunker was an anomaly, but an example. The town, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the revelation with its self-image. This was a place defined by familiarity, by the belief that nothing truly hidden could exist within its limits. The bunker challenged that belief at a fundamental level. People asked how many times they had walked above it, parked near it, driven past without knowing. The ground beneath their routines had contained a secret, and that knowledge altered how they viewed their own history. Trust, once fractured, does not easily repair itself. As investigators pieced together fragments of context, a broader picture began to form, not a clear narrative, but a shape. A sense that the bunker had been part of a network of precautions built during a time when fear justified extraordinary measures, when decisions were made quickly, quietly, and often without oversight. In that environment, disappearance could be reframed as collateral rather than catastrophe. That was perhaps the most disturbing implication of all. The bunker wasn't sinister in a dramatic way. It didn't suggest malice so much as indifference. It represented a mindset where individuals were secondary to objectives, where consequences were abstracted until they no longer felt personal. And within that abstraction, a person could be lost. As this understanding deepened, the officer's disappearance took on a new emotional weight. It was no longer just a tragedy of circumstance. It was a consequence of systems that prioritized secrecy over humanity. The bunker didn't just hide things. It erased responsibility. Even now, decades later, that erasure lingered. Records remained incomplete. Explanations came wrapped in qualifiers. No one could or would say definitively who had ordered the bunker's construction, who had maintained it, or why it had been placed exactly where it was. The truth existed, but it was fragmented, scattered across institutions that no longer communicated, across memories that had faded or been intentionally suppressed. For the family, this lack of clarity was a familiar pain. Answers hovered just out of reach, close enough to suggest meaning, but not close enough to provide peace. The bunker explained the disappearance in theory, but theory did little to address the emotional reality of loss. What they were left with was an understanding that the disappearance had not been random, that it had intersected with forces larger than any one person, forces that operated quietly, efficiently, and without apology. As the investigation pressed on, one thing became clear. The bunker had not simply been forgotten. It had been designed to be forgotten. And in that design lay the most haunting truth of all, not just about what happened to the officer, but about how easily a system could make someone vanish, and how long the ground could keep that secret without anyone truly noticing. Entering deeper into the bunker shifted the investigation from theory into something far more intimate. Until that point, the structure itself had dominated attention. Its secrecy, its construction, its deliberate absence from history. But as rooms were cleared and cataloged, the focus changed. The bunker was no longer just a hidden place. It became a container for memory. What they found was not dramatic in the way people expect hidden spaces to be. There were no elaborate control panels, still humming with power, no obvious signs of catastrophe frozen in time. Instead, there are objects, ordinary things, the kind that rarely survive long enough to be noticed, let alone preserved. A chair pulled slightly away from a table, as if someone had stood up and never returned. A metal locker with its door ajar, empty but not abandoned in haste. Shelving units holding equipment whose purpose was technical and dull, made unsettling only by context. Everything sat exactly where it had last been used. Dust-coated surfaces evenly, undisturbed by movement for decades. Its softened edges, blurred distinctions, made time visible. In places, it was thick enough to record the faint marks of earlier steps. Proof that others had been here once, long before this discovery. Investigators moved slowly, deliberately. Each object was photographed, documented, handled with care that bordered on reverence, not because the items were valuable in themselves, but because of what they represented. Presence, routine, human involvement. The deeper they went, the more personal the space felt. In one room, they found a shelf that had clearly been used for storage beyond standard equipment. A mug sat near the edge, its surface dull with age. No cracks, no dramatic damage. Just a cup, left behind. The kind of thing someone sets down without thinking, assuming they'll pick it up again in a few minutes. That assumption lingered heavily in the air. Nearby, there were papers, forms, logs, notes written in handwriting that varied from precise to hurried. Most were procedural, their language stripped of emotion by design. But even official documents carry fingerprints of the people who filled them out. A margin note here, a correction there, evidence of someone thinking, deciding, existing. Nothing about these items suggested panic. That absence was as telling as any sign of struggle would have been. Whatever had happened here had unfolded within a framework of control. Time may have run out, but it hadn't exploded. In a corner, tucked away as if intentionally separated from the rest, were personal effects that did not belong to the bunker's infrastructure. Clothing folded neatly. Not packed, not stuffed into a bag, but arranged. A jacket, shoes placed side by side. These were not artifacts of a workplace. They were traces of a person adapting to circumstances they hadn't planned for. Each item was examined carefully, compared against records, photographs, memories. The conclusions that followed were quiet, restrained, but unmistakable. These were consistent with what the officer would have worn. Not definitive proof, but alignment, enough to make denial difficult. For decades, the officer had existed as an absence, a question mark, a missing space in family photos and official records. Here, in this underground room, that absence condensed into something tangible, not the person themselves, but the outline of their presence. The effect was profound. Those involved in the discovery described an unexpected emotional response. It wasn't shock or horror. It was something slower, heavier, a sense of intrusion, not into a crime scene, but into a private moment frozen in time. This was not a place meant to be found. It had not been abandoned. It had been sealed, and now it was being opened by people who could never fully understand what it had been like to be here when it mattered. More objects emerged as the search continued. A notebook with pages filled unevenly, some dense with writing, others left blank. The content was mundane, observations, times, notes that made sense only in context. But even without full understanding, the human impulse behind them was clear: to record, to impose order, to stay oriented. That impulse spoke volumes. It suggested awareness, adaptation, survival, at least for a time. The bunker had not been a momentary intersection. It had been a place where time passed. How much time was difficult to determine, but enough for routines to form, however briefly. Enough for objects to be arranged rather than discarded. That realization complicated the narrative in uncomfortable ways. The disappearance had been imagined as sudden, a moment where something went wrong and a life vanished. But these objects hinted at duration, at a stretch of existence that had unfolded unseen, underground, disconnected from the world above. That gap between disappearance and discovery was suddenly crowded with possibility. Investigators were careful not to speculate publicly. The temptation to construct a complete story from partial evidence was strong, but restraint prevailed. Each object was allowed to speak only to what it could confirm: that someone had been here, that they had lived within these walls for some amount of time, and that they had left behind traces not meant to be found. For the officer's family, seeing these items was both devastating and grounding. After decades of imagining, of wondering, of living with uncertainty, there was finally something real to confront. Not closure, but confirmation. Proof that the disappearance had not been an illusion. They were faced with a paradox. These objects brought their loved one closer than they had been in years. Yet they also underscored the distance that could never be bridged. Time had moved forward relentlessly, and whatever had happened here belonged to a past that could not be revisited. Grief shifted shape. It was no longer fueled solely by not knowing. It was now intertwined with the knowledge that knowing everything was impossible, that even with physical evidence, the full emotional truth of what had been experienced in that bunker would remain locked away. As analysis continued, subtle details gained significance. The way items were positioned suggested intention. Nothing appeared random. This wasn't the aftermath of chaos. It was the residue of endurance. The bunker, once defined by secrecy, now revealed something else entirely: vulnerability. It had been designed as a controlled environment, a place meant to protect systems, information, continuity. But within its walls, a human presence had transformed it. The structure had not anticipated fear, loneliness, or the slow erosion of hope. Those emotions did not leave clear physical marks. They lingered invisibly, inferred through arrangement, through absence, through the quiet persistence of ordinary things. Investigators spoke later about how difficult it was to leave that space each day. Ascending back to the surface felt wrong, almost like abandoning someone again. The air above ground seemed too loud, too fast, too unconcerned with what had been uncovered below. The contrast was jarring. Above ground, life continued uninterrupted. Cars passed. Phones rang. People talked about the discovery with curiosity, even excitement. But underground, time had stopped in a way that resisted spectacle. The objects found there did not scream their importance. They whispered it. They asked to be remembered not as clues, but as evidence of humanity persisting in isolation, of a person navigating a reality that had no precedent, no witnesses, no guarantee of return. In the end, those objects did what decades of investigation could not. They restored dimension to the story. They transformed a missing person into a lived experience. However incomplete, the bunker explained how the disappearance could happen. But these objects explained something else entirely. They explained that being lost is not the same as being gone, and that sometimes the most haunting truths are not found in dramatic revelations, but in the quiet remnants of a life interrupted and left behind. As the pieces began to settle into place, the truth that emerged was not the kind anyone had been waiting for. There was no single villain to point to, no moment of dramatic betrayal or violence that could be isolated and condemned. What came into focus instead was something quieter, more unsettling in its ordinariness. The bunker had not been a rogue operation. It was part of a framework, one built during a time when fear shaped policy, and secrecy was treated as a form of protection. Decisions had been made quickly, layered with assumptions about necessity and risk. In that environment, transparency was considered a liability. The officer's presence there was not intentional. It was an accident of proximity and timing, a routine patrol intersecting with infrastructure that was never meant to be encountered. Once that boundary was crossed, procedure took over, not human judgment, but protocol. And protocol, when stripped of empathy, can be unforgiving. Records suggested that once the officer entered the space, the response was containment rather than rescue, not out of malice, but out of caution, exposure risk, information security. The belief that revealing the existence of the bunker would create more danger than concealing the incident ever could. The choice was not framed as abandoning a person. It was framed as protecting a system. That distinction mattered to those who made it. It allowed responsibility to dissolve into policy, into layers of approval and justification that no single individual felt fully accountable for. The result was a tragedy shaped not by cruelty, but by detachment. For the family, this explanation landed heavily. It offered answers, but no comfort, knowing that their loved one had not been forgotten, but rather deliberately obscured. Introduced a different kind of pain. The idea that survival may have been possible, even briefly, only sharpened the loss. Justice, in the conventional sense, remained elusive. Too much time had passed. Records were incomplete. Those involved were gone or shielded by structures designed to outlast scrutiny. Accountability, like the bunker itself, had been buried deep enough to resist excavation. The truth did not restore balance. It did not feel proportional to the years of waiting, the life shaped by absence. It explained the disappearance, but it did not explain how to live with it. What remained was a recognition that systems built to protect can also erase, and that sometimes the most devastating outcomes are born not from intent to harm, but from the decision to look away. For the family, the years between disappearance and explanation had never been empty. They were filled with waiting, with imagining, with learning how to hold space for someone who was both gone and somehow still present. The discovery of the bunker did not end that process. It reshaped it. There was a strange finality in seeing proof after so much uncertainty. Not relief, exactly, but a shift. For decades, hope had been something fragile, carefully protected from disappointment. Now it had nowhere left to go. The question was no longer whether the officer would come home, but how to live in a world where the truth arrived long after it could change anything. The family spoke about time differently than others did. For them, it had not moved forward in a straight line. It looped, returned, stalled. Every unanswered year had carried the weight of possibility. Every birthday, every holiday, had been marked by absence as much as presence. The bunker introduced a new kind of grief. It was no longer abstract. It was anchored to a place, a set of circumstances, a series of decisions that made it harder in some ways. There was something to point to now, something tangible to absorb anger and sorrow. But there was also the knowledge that no amount of understanding could recover what had been lost. Memories took on sharper edges. Ordinary moments were revisited with new context. Conversations replayed, gestures reinterpreted. The family found themselves wondering what their loved one had thought in those final unseen days, whether they had hoped, whether they had been afraid. Those questions had no answers, and yet they demanded to be asked. Public attention returned briefly, then faded again. Statements were issued. Apologies were carefully worded. But apologies could not reach back across decades. They could not restore the years shaped by uncertainty, or the life that had been lived in parallel absence. What remained was resilience, built slowly and without ceremony. The family had learned to carry the weight of not knowing. Now they had to learn to carry the weight of knowing too late. Neither was easy. They chose, in the end, to remember the officer not as a mystery or a symbol, but as a person whose life had mattered beyond the circumstances of its disappearance. That choice was an act of quiet defiance against a system that had reduced a human being to a problem to be contained. The truth had arrived, but closure did not follow. What followed instead was a deeper understanding of loss, and a recognition that love does not end when answers finally begin. When everything that could be uncovered had been examined, cataloged, and explained, there was still a lingering sense that the story had not truly ended. The bunker, once opened, did not remain accessible. After investigations concluded, it was sealed again, this time deliberately, officially. Concrete replaced soil. Locks replaced secrecy. On paper, the site was documented at last. In reality, it slipped back into stillness. But the ground did not forget. Neither did the town. People passed the area without knowing exactly where to look, yet feeling something all the same. A subtle awareness that beneath the ordinary surface of roads and grass lay a reminder of how easily certainty can fracture. The bunker had offered answers, but had also introduced new questions about trust, about authority, about what else might exist unseen within familiar boundaries. The disappearance, once a story defined by silence, was now defined by delay. Truth had arrived decades too late to prevent harm, too late to change outcomes. It served not as resolution, but as reflection. What unsettled people most was not what had been hidden, but how effectively it had been hidden. How systems meant to protect could operate without accountability, without visibility, and without regard for the individuals caught in their machinery. The bunker stood as proof that absence is sometimes engineered, not accidental. For some, the knowledge brought caution, a quieter skepticism toward assurances and official narratives. For others, it brought sadness, a recognition that justice is not guaranteed simply because time passes. The officer's name was spoken more often now, but differently, not as a missing person, not as a rumor, but as a reminder of a life intersecting with something larger and colder than it should have, of a routine night that had revealed the fragility of normalcy. There was no comfort in knowing that the mystery had an explanation. The explanation itself carried weight. It suggested that answers do not always heal, and that understanding can sometimes deepen unease rather than resolve it. The ground, once silent, had given up its secret, but secrets, once revealed, do not vanish. They change form. They settle into memory, into history, into the quiet awareness that some stories end not with peace, but with a deeper, more enduring question. What else remains unseen? And how long does it take before the truth, buried carefully and patiently, decides to rise again? Developer mode,